Director of Action for Autism and National Center for Autism. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you.
Today is the Autism Day, and it's our pleasure to have you on board. And we would take you through the gamut of your past as to how you achieved all that you've achieved so far.
Okay.
With an insight into what is autism. My first question, what is autism, ma'am?
Autism is a neurological condition, so which means that the brains of people with autism are slightly different from those with who are non-autistic. And what happens when you have autism is that there are certain areas of development that are affected specifically. So one is communication. So when we say communication, we are not talking about speech per se, even though there are a lot of people with autism whose speech does not develop or develops very late. But what it means when we say communication is being able to express your needs, your thoughts, your feelings, your desires, and that is where people with autism have difficulties, even those who often have fairly good speech. So there would be issues like not getting the meaning of what is being said from the context, but understanding it from the literal surface value. So if I say, can you pass me the milk? It is not a question about your ability to pass me the milk. Because when you look at the words, it says, can you pass me the milk? So it's like I'm asking you, can you do that? But what I'm actually doing is I'm requesting. Right? So the words per se has one meaning, but the intent gives us a different meaning. And that is really what happens with jokes, with sarcasm, because I'm saying something but I'm meaning something else. So people with autism have a lot of difficulties with this. They also have difficulty in complex sentence structures. You could be very intelligent and yet have difficulties in these areas. Using the body to communicate. People who are hearing impaired and do not have speech, they use their bodies, their hands. I could say, and you know what I mean. Right. So people with autism do not usually use their bodies to communicate, even simple things like this. Right? And they often have difficulty in understanding. They'll understand some of the basic gestural communication, but the more complex ones they would have difficulties with. There is also the area of social understanding. So, our world is regulated by the way we understand the social world around us. And it does not matter whether I am an owner of a company or I'm a simple vegetable seller on the road. I need a lot of social skills to be able to interact and get what I need done. So that is perhaps the most critical area of impairment in autism. In addition, there are repetitive and restrictive thoughts and behaviors. So there would be the need to do things in a particular way. There'd be difficulty in dealing with change. You see a manifestation of that in small children in the way they play with toys. So most kids with autism will not play with toys in very typical ways. They would play with blocks and puzzles, things that are more spatial. But wherever there is the use of abstractions and imagination coming in. So if they play with a doll, most of them will not, but those who do would play in the same way every time. Or with a car, it'll just be pushing back and forth and not, expand and develop like it does with other kids. So another child might, one day scold the doll, the next take it to school, feed it, do different things every time, and the whole thing expands. So play would also be affected. So these are the kind of main areas, but there is one more area which is in the way they process the environment around them. So we process the environment through our senses, so the way we see, hear, feel, so there and the way we understand our body in space. So these are again areas where people with autism process differently or may also have difficulties in.
How is autism different from other psychiatric disorders? Many people, what I have as a lay person spoken to, they usually intermingle or find very blurring grey shades between mental retardation and autism. There is a notion in common masses
Right.
that retardation overlaps or autism overlaps
Right.
the other aspect.
See,
Are they mentally retarded?
not all of them. About, perhaps from what we understand now, about 50% of them will have mental retardation, but another 50% will not. But they may function at a cognitive level that might be lower than their ability because of the way autism affects them. The thing with mental retardation is that, we have developmental areas, whether it is the way we communicate, we talked about social, the way we run, the way we dress ourselves, feed ourselves. So all of these develop at particular ages for all of us, right? Children, they get head control, they sit up, they stand, they walk, they run at different ages, and most of us do it at roughly the same time. When you have mental retardation, there would be a general delay or slowness across all these domains. When you have autism, the slowness would primarily be in the areas of communication and social, and sometimes there would be a lot of unevenness. So you could have somebody who is not able to hold a pencil, is say a 3-year-old, is not, forget about a pencil, a 3-year-old who's not able to hold a toy and manipulate it well, but is able to climb a jungle gym and hang from it by one hand.
Right.
So there would be a lot of unevenness in development. So there is a clear difference between intellectual impairment or mental retardation and autism. And like I said, many of them may not have intellectual impairment. And see, the other thing you might see that two kids the same age, one with intellectual impairment, the other with autism, the one with intellectual impairment is able to dress himself, feed himself, but is not able to read or any of that. The child with autism, say 2 8-year-olds, the kid with autism is perhaps not able to dress himself, right? Has a lot of issues about what he eats and how he feeds himself, but may have learned to use the computer at age 2 without being taught,
Right.
and is able to read everything. So there's a clear difference between the two. And you also mentioned psychiatric illnesses.
Yes.
There is confusion between the two because there is not often a clear understanding of autism. So because it manifests as behaviors, if you do not understand autism, you perceive the behaviors as being psychotic behaviors, whereas actually they're just manifestation of various ways of trying to communicate. If you truly know autism, you can tell the difference between the two.
Is there a mechanism by virtue of which we can segregate the autistic children who are semi-mentally retarded and those who are not at a very early stage, so that they could be absorbed into the mainstream and they could be utilized as workforce and their lives be corrected, going forward?
Right. See, first of all, that whole premise is faulty. If you have mental retardation, let's forget about autism, there is this perception that some of them, that old thing, educable, trainable, it's not true. You really do not know what the potential of an individual is. You can have somebody with mental retardation who's been written off and who's actually doing a great deal. So we should not even start with that premise of this one could do more and that one may not be able to. That is a very old premise that has now been completely discarded. And the same is true with kids with autism. You cannot really tell when you do the diagnosis that this one is going to be able to do more and that one would be able to do less. There are ones who often seem to have significant impairments, who I personally know, I can think of right off the bat one kid who's in the regular school completely included. He still has autism, right? But he's functioning fine. Right, didn't speak till he was pretty, I think 5 years old or something. So if we start with the premise that this one will be able to learn and that one, then we bring in those old ideas of learning, teaching and learning, which are completely gone. We do not presume disability or inability in anyone. We presume ability in everybody, do the best in helping everybody, and then see what potential they are able to get to.
My next question is that I've spoken to many parents, the other day, and the kind of perception that I somehow gathered was that these parents were suggesting that they were looking for an autistic certificate, and somehow the requisite doctors gave a mental retardation certificate or something of that sort.
Yeah.
So, are there channels? Is it a difference of opinion between the parents of the ward who's autistic, or are medical fraternity less equipped, sensitized, less trained in that sense to grapple with the needs of these parents?
Right.
And they were disillusioned. They are still hunting for an autistic certificate. So, what are the channels? Is there any gray shade in this as well? And what is your organization doing per se?
Right. See, yes, there is a need to educate physicians a lot more, but that's not what this is really about. The thing is that you cannot get an autism certificate.
There's nothing like autism.
Yes, because disability certificate is something that is mentioned in the Persons with Disabilities Act. So if the disability is not mentioned in the Act, then you cannot get a disability certificate for that particular disability. So doctors will not give you a certificate for autism, they'll give you for...
Sorry to bother you. You were trying to suggest that in this particular act, we still do not have autism.
No, we do not. We do not have autism there. Autism is there in the National Trust Act, but the National Trust does not talk about disability certificates. Now, either of two things could be done. One, the National Trust could be amended to bring in this thing of a disability certificate, but then there has to be the desire and the willpower of people in authority to do that, right? If that were to happen, then yes, there could be disability certificates for autism. And interestingly, the National Trust, when it was set up, it has, autism, mental retardation, etc. mentioned in it. And that's something that we struggled to get in. And one of the important things of the National Trust was this concept of a guardian for those who would need support as adults, right? Even though autism is there, there is not a single individual with autism who has been able to take guardianship with an autism certificate. National Trust has this provision. It's completely underused.
Why is that? What are the provisions that actually are hindering this?
Because there is to get a guardianship certificate, you need to have a disability certificate saying autism.
You're trying to suggest that the two mechanisms are not interlaced.
It's not there. So if you don't have the thing of the certificate, you cannot get a guardianship certificate. So for instance, I don't have a certificate for autism for my son.
Right.
So even though my son is now 33, and I had hoped when he was young, because you always start off with believing that he will get there.
There's a roadmap.
Yeah, and then, he's not been able to get, he's done a huge amount, but he still is not able to manage his bank account himself. And I have an account jointly with him. Right. Now, if I were to drop dead,
there's nobody to look after.
That account is stuck.
Stuck up.
Right. Because I cannot get a disability certificate and be a guardian for him, or appoint somebody as a guardian for him, appoint anybody else as a guardian for him. Right. It is not possible. And that is why there was this recent discussion on the law that you were talking about earlier, the new law, which would have included a whole lot of other disabilities and left a window for the addition of more disabilities.
So why isn't this law dynamic? I mean, medicine is progressing.
See, the thing is that the law that was drafted eventually ended up, after intervention from the government, as not a very well written law. It is not a very well written law. It needs a lot of improvement. But the way we saw it, that one step forward, just a one step forward is better than no step forward.
Right.
But not everybody in the disability community agreed on that. because not everybody has the difficulties that certain other disabilities have.
Absolutely.
And for people like, like say for instance, perhaps this would not be an appropriate thing to say, but supposing if I had autism and also had locomotor impairment, then I could get a certificate for locomotor impairment. So that would help because that's there in the PWD Act. But if you have autism, many of them do not have intellectual impairment.
Right.
Many of them don't. I know one young man who had got a disability certificate for mental retardation when he was young, and he apparently has an IQ of 20.
My God.
Okay.
Amazing.
And an IQ of, this is from a government doctor from a very well-known hospital, an IQ of 20. He's doing regular academics at a few grades below his level because he started much later.
Right.
Much later. Yes. He's an absolutely, a young man with no intellectual impairment. None whatsoever. Right? He taught himself to read Hindi. English he was learning at school. He taught himself to read Hindi. He's fluent and he's developed enormously. Right? But if he were to go, it so happened that his mother took a disability certificate when he was young for intellectual impairment. But if he were to go now, he wouldn't be able to get anything because there is nothing for autism and he wouldn't get one for intellectual impairment.
So this is
it's a very complex situation. And this will not change because there is no new law going to come. And you see the state of our political...
You were in the drafting committee of this particular law. What's your approach towards the people with whom you interacted, the government officials and others who be there? What was your, how do you take the whole thing? Why there are impediments?
The impediment was not so much from the government this time. The government was willing to pass it. It was from the disability community, which is divided, which says, we must have the perfect law or we will not have a law.
Disability community? I didn't get that.
Because disability is not just autism. There are various kinds of disabilities. And there is a very strong section of self-advocates. So you don't have self-advocates in India for autism or intellectual impairment. You really don't. But you have self-advocates from the more physical disabilities, the sensorial disabilities, right? So, when they come and say, then, obviously, naturally, if somebody with disability is telling you that, no, you should not do this, the government will feel, and we are, after all, only parents. But then we are the only support our children have. Till such time, people with autism can speak out. But you see, when you have a mental disability, right, the stigma is huge. And you have a mental disability where it is very hard for you to understand the social rules. You're laughed at most of the time. I've seen that happen. I've seen people with autism.
Absolutely, yes. Same here.
Yeah. They're laughed at.
What's the road ahead for this bill then? Are we stuck up? Are we going to stay in the suspended animation for infinite period of time? Is there hope? Are you doing something about it?
Well, let the elections take place. Let the next government come. Let's see what their commitment is to social issues.
Right.
See, that has to be the other thing. Yes. How much is a government interested in matters like this? See, what the government does not realize, what governments do not realize, is that there is a huge disability community out there. Right. Huge. What the census tells us is not the real numbers.
Right.
But it's not seen as a community that really has any value, right? That they can contribute in any way to the community, right? So politicians don't care about disability. So it has to be seen which political party comes in and what their commitment to social issues is, and then we'll have to take it from there.
You must have interacted with many parliamentarians across the spectrum without getting much into the political jargon as such, staying apolitical as much as possible. What's their sensitization towards these issues? What's their level of understanding? What's their approach? Are they stimulated enough to augur enough courage, to muster enough muscle, to push through things which are actually the root cause of many ailments in the Indian society?
See, I don't want to mention political parties. I don't want to turn it into this thing.
Say political.
Generally. So there were some politicians who are very, very pro-disability. That's been our experience, right? And then there are others who appeared to be so, but then when your back was turned, they did something else.
Just a lip service.
Just lip service. You know, there were politicians who made us feel so hopeful,
Yes.
and then your back is turned and they're saying something completely different. So, you know, you wonder that where does politics end and public service begin in our country?
Right. So the focus is not there.
Not really.
Concentrated.
Like I said, there are some politicians who are truly committed.
Right.
Right? They may not be politicians who are particularly liked, whatever. I don't care about that. All I care about is X or Y or Z, is somebody who's truly supportive, who says something and follows through, or at least makes an effort. And then there might be A, B, and C who will say something and you feel, oh wow, you know, they're really supportive. And then you find they don't give two hoots.
Yes. Okay, coming to this, what is TEACH? You've introduced this specific program.
Okay.
What is TEACH? T-A.
Oh, okay.
T-A-C-C-H.
All right, TEACH. Well, now it is just known as TEACH. It stands for Treatment and Education of Autistic and Communication Handicapped Children. Right. It is one of the established methods of teaching for people with autism.
Right.
Along with, there's a whole lot of others. There is, you know, there are lots of them now. There is ABA, there is ESDM, there is...
Implementing these through your organization, APA.
Yes.
All right.
But the thing is that TEACH is the one which, and we use a combination of all of these, right? We do not believe in following any one method because we do not believe that every child benefits from any one method.
Right.
It's not true. And actually, even in the West, many organizations are now realizing this and beginning to use a combination, right? And I've seen some of the excellent centers where they do this. They use a combination because they realize you cannot just go with one. And like I said, we use a combination. The reason why I really like TEACH, and I want to mention it, and I want to mention it particularly, is because people do not realize how important it is. There is too much of hype about certain other methods, and I don't want to take names of methods, and we use those methods. But TEACH is the one that is the lifespan approach.
Right.
TEACH is the one that you need with the individual who has extremely high needs, and you need it with the one that is able to lead a fairly inclusive lives.
Right.
It is something across the spectrum. So what is TEACH about? It is really about providing predictability to people with autism.
Right.
This is the one thing that they need.
This is more like a holistic approach to it.
Yes. And what teachers see, what it does, see the way, unfortunately, people with autism are taught oftentimes, the focus is very strongly on fixing the child, on changing the child, on making the child non-autistic. So you almost teach the child to be ashamed of what he or she is. You never do that with somebody who has Down syndrome. You don't do that with somebody who has visual impairment. But you do that with autism. Somebody who has visual impairment, you take the trouble, if you're an evolved society, of providing braille, of providing JAWS, of providing, textured pathways. You provide voices in lifts so that people who cannot see are receiving environmental supports.
Right.
With autism, the belief is you fix the child and make him behave non-autistic.
Right.
What TEACH talks about is providing these supports. Give them the structure, give them the visuals that will help them function in society, and teach them skills. But do not only, just like with people who are blind, you teach them the skills, you teach them how to read braille, you teach them mobility skills, but you also provide the supports. And that is what TEACH is about.
Right. You've also been associated with the launch of Autism India Network. What is it?
it was launched many years ago, but then there are many other things that come up. Basically, the idea when it was started was to get organizations to work together.
Like-minded organizations.
Yeah. Rather than be two things, little islands, because we have a lot to learn from each other. I don't know everything, you don't know everything, right? We each can learn from each other. And that was the aim. And Autism India Network is now kind of, defunct, but it is working in the sense that we work with each other, we share a lot. In fact, I was in Mumbai yesterday and day before with many of the Mumbai organizations, not one. It was brought together by the Forum for Autism, but many of them coming together on a discussion on prevention of abuse of children in education, children with autism in education, something that is rampant. So, and to bring out a charter on that. So we were working together. And as a part of World Autism Awareness Month, we are closing the month with a flash mob that will happen across the country. We know at least 8 organizations that have started up. Right. So, if we said that, we'll do it in Delhi and keep it at that, that's no fun. It's better that we all do it. It's like when they light it up blue, that's another campaign that happens. We ensured, and that time not everybody knew about it. We ensured that, people got to know about it. Now, they just check things out on the internet and they do their own stuff. Right. So it's important for all of us to work with each other, share our learnings, because that's the way to go forward, rather than and right now we are working on residences for adults, because there are many adults with autism who will require supported living arrangements, who will not be able to live independently.
This is just the private initiative, or you have
private initiative?
There's no governmental.
No
organized.
No. So what we are trying to do is there are organizations that are trying to run residences.
Helping you out, big corporate.
Yeah, it's just starting, and so the point I was trying to make is that many of the organizations have got together to let's think and brainstorm. A parent and a sister, they said, let's do something about it. So we all got together and we're going to have ongoing meetings on what are the systems to evolve for this, for instance. Because we can all learn from each other, from our mistakes, from our successes. So networking is very good. And to get back to the government thing, actually under the National Trust, there are some residences that are run, but there is nothing for autism. None that I know of that are run structured to the needs of people with autism.
Right.
Structured to their needs so that they can live independently within that supported environment.
Are there any insurances? I mean, I was just wondering.
There is no insurance if you have disability.
At the age of 60, somebody survives till that period.
No. You cannot insure a person with autism.
No, I mean, who looks after him? I mean, parents can walk with an autistic child.
Right, but when they are dead, what happens?
When they're dead, what happens?
That's what this is all about.
And especially those who come from the
poorer section. Absolutely.
Section of society.
Absolutely.
I mean,
it's the duty of the government really to provide these supports. And what there is now for people with disabilities that are run by the government are kinds of places where most of us cannot imagine putting a child in, not just my child. If I found a child on the street and I had to put the child there, I would be devastated to put the child there.
I was just thinking in my head, as you were suggesting, there are autistic people with mental retardation, if I get it correctly, and there are autistic people who have no mental retardation. At the age of 62, somebody who has not nurtured a proper way of communication, somebody who has nurtured who's not communicated to that extent, and has to go to a hospital and carries no identification, no marking that I am autistic.
Right.
And the way doctors are hard pressed at government hospitals, he would not have time to understand his medical ailment.
Yeah.
And
no, you're
62
right.
could be a very sensitive age.
And many of them who have no intellectual impairment would also have a lot of difficulty in communicating their needs.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Many of them would. So we don't have that social support in our country.
What's the census? I mean, do you have any ballpark figures?
See, this...
Vague figures. I'm not...
No, see, the census, the last census figures by, I think, 2.8%, which is a crazy figure. And it's not autism. It's all disabilities.
Right.
The reality is that,
Must
this,
be 6 times, 4 times?
of course, at least 10 times, 10% to 12% have.
There's no budget allocation.
There is under the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment.
How much is that? Rough idea?
No, I really don't know the exact numbers.
But frugal, I
But
suppose.
a lot of it doesn't get used. Forget about long-term stuff. We, amongst all the various things we do, we run a small special needs school,
Right.
which is a training ground for people across the country and outside the country, in Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, who set up schools.
Right.
Right. We don't get any funding from the government.
Right.
We have no idea why.
Right.
We apply, and you never get to know why you're not getting the money. Some organizations do, some don't. The money just sits there. It's not that the money is not there,
Absolutely.
but it remains there unspent, and it's not for lack of asking. It's not for lack of asking.
So the motivation is not there again.
I have no idea how these
But
things
the
work.
direction is not there.
Not there. And very often, and I know I'll probably get a lot of people really angry. We keep saying the politicians are terrible, the politicians are terrible.
It's the
What is
bureaucracy.
exactly what is happening in the bureaucracy? If an organization that even the government turns to for support, right, is not getting any funding for a school which is open for anybody to visit anytime.
Right.
We don't hide anything. You can come into a classroom, observe from outside and see what is happening. We don't get any support. We lose some of our best staff to private schools because we cannot pay the way they do. How much money can you raise?
So the pay commissions and
Yeah,
stuff like
so
that.
no, it doesn't apply to us.
Doesn't apply to
And
you. I know
and we
that,
get no funding
No.
from the government. School is not
even
worth
from an
funding.
indirect route where there's a social body of government which
Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment.
some other modality where they do transfer the funds.
Sometimes we are extremely tempted to take some of the more complex cases and land up at Shastri Bhavan and let them loose out there so that they figure out what it is like. Because people with autism look so typical.
Right.
So they say, and when they come and visit, because we've provided them with a very structured environment,
Yes.
they do not understand how much of skill goes into these kids who seem, they can manage everything. The amount of skill that is behind what you are seeing, they don't get it.
Great. I mean, it's great insight that you've given. Tell me one thing. Being an Ashoka Fellow, having treaded all the way from journalistic background, how has it been, this long road?
It's been great. I think working with kids with autism has been one of the most fun things ever. It is truly fun. You have to speak to some of the people who work with us. And you got to really enjoy challenges. And they're really such an amazing bunch of people.
Right.
It's so amazing that the way their minds work. That has been a learning.
Yes.
They have taught us so much. And I've really enjoyed every minute of what I do.
How did this migration from journalism to being the founder of
Okay.
the APA
Okay. Oh, that has happened
having
because
read at Kaufman's US and really trained yourself, honed your skills towards the autistic approach.
right.
How did this come about?
Okay.
It's a very unique divergence from what you were initially trained post schooling, from your college
Right,
days,
right,
all this way
right.
down up to here.
You know what is interesting? I used to volunteer in special needs when I was in college.
Right.
I did not know then that I will eventually have somebody with special needs in my own family.
Right.
I have a son who's 33 who has autism.
Yes, I did
Right.
learn that.
And so when he was diagnosed, you can imagine in those days,
Was that the motivation factor?
yeah, simply because initially, of course, I didn't understand it was different from intellectual impairment. But then I figured that, there was no understanding in the country, no awareness, no services, nothing. And so, you eventually train yourself and you start to, it's very easy to say, okay, let's migrate to Canada or something.
Right.
But it's much better to get something happening here, that because there would be other people with autism. So I guess that was the motivation to start something. And I don't regret it, never regretted it. It's been a great journey.
What's your message to people at large on this Autism Day today?
Accept people with autism for the people they are. Never be ashamed or embarrassed of your child, right? Just like you would not be ashamed or embarrassed of yourself. They have as much right to their culture as we have to ours. And accept diversity, celebrate diversity. And the slogan of our organization has always been autistic, different and proud of it. And that's what I would talk about.
It was a pleasure talking to you, ma'am.
And happy World Autism Awareness Day. Thank you.